Well, I'm joined now by Professor James Allan, Professor of Law, and a man who I've heard described as Australia's Jordan Peterson. Make of that good or bad what you will. I've genuinely heard people describe you that way.
I'm a lot poorer.
Well, there is
put it
that.
in those terms.
But funny enough, your background originally is actually Canadian, is it not?
Toronto, and in fact, when he first came out, his very first tour, I introduced him in Brisbane.
Is that right?
Well,
yeah, wow. Well, you're someone that I've thoroughly enjoyed listening to your commentary over the years, and we're going to have to fight with vacuum cleaners and various other things. We're in the atrium of the Church and State Summit here in Brisbane. Now, James, I want to talk a little bit about sort of the Anglosphere. You're originally from Canada, you've spent many years in Australia, but you're very well travelled and you're someone who I think sees the bigger picture. What we've seen in the last few years, COVID included, but not exclusively, is the Western world seems to have taken a very similar path in the last few years. Big spending, now leading to a lot of inflation, increases in the size of government, the intervention of government, these sorts of things. Why do you believe that's become the, or do you agree that that's the zeitgeist at the moment? Why do you believe that's the case?
Well, yes. I mean, it used to be that the Anglosphere was the best part of the democratic world, and now it's probably the worst in terms of cowardice amongst the political leaders. So my own take is there's an economic side of it, and there's a failure to fight the culture wars.
Right.
And in one way, the culture is more important than anything. I mean, I would sacrifice money out of my paycheck to have a sane schooling system and you know, people who stood up to men wanting to play in women's sports, that sort of thing. I do think that politicians have fallen victim to the fact that almost all of the economic advisors are Keynesians.
Yes.
And they're all afraid of any kind of recession. And so they sell people on the idea of GDP, which isn't a great measure, right? It's just a measure of economic activity, basically government spending of any sort. And so on that model, if you have an island of 100 people and you let 100 in that year, GDP has to go up.
Sure.
But what people never get told is your GDP per person has gone down. So Japan has almost no immigration, and their GDP per person is about the same as Australia's in the last 15, 20 years. And we have had 2 GDP per person recessions in the last little while. I don't know how many years, it hasn't been that many. And so in order to combat the fear of a recession, they print money, they had 0 interest rates. Sure, COVID made it way, way worse, but it was still bad.
Yeah.
And what happens when you have really low interest rates? We used to have the economic settings to favor savers. I come from a long line of Scots, Calvinists, sort of. You should be rewarding savers. We reward borrowers, and inflation hurts saving.
Yeah.
And so if you have very low interest rates and print money like crazy, you inevitably have asset inflation. And poor people don't have assets, and rich people do. I mean, this happened on steroids during the thuggish years of the lockdown. It was the 3 best years to be a billionaire ever. Yeah. We took money from the poor and gave it to the rich, and we took money from the young who faced no risks at all from COVID, and we gave it to the super wealthy. And you know, this was done by right-of-center governments. They should be ashamed of themselves.
You've touched on so many great topics there. I want to come back to this issue of the asset inflation. You're absolutely spot on, and this is one of the things that I warned of very early in COVID.
I just want to be clear. I mean, if I had loads of assets, I might have a slightly different... They don't want to be too judgmental. We want to keep an open
Yeah,
mind.
that's right. That's right. It depends on whether I benefited or not.
Exactly. Yeah.
Now, one of the things that Konstantin Kisin, who's now touring in Australia at the moment, and I heard him at the ARC launch in London a little while ago, was warning against, is if we disenfranchise younger people because the assets are out of their reach, they've been inflated beyond the point where they can become homeowners, then in a sense we're disenfranchising them from settling down, having families, actually progressing through the stages of life that we would have called normal 20, 30, 40 years ago. Do you agree with that assessment, or what do you think the impact of what we've seen economically is likely to be going forward?
I do agree with that, but I think one of the even bigger factor is we're just letting, Australia's got the highest per capita legal immigration, and you're just letting so many people in, and there's so little, development because of NIMBY rules, that also is driving up prices. And that's probably driving it up more. So in Britain, they've got these green belts, they're beautiful. Well, stop letting in so many people. I mean, I'm not against immigration, I am one, but it's just completely crazy compared to non-Anglosphere countries. I mean, Canada, Australia, Britain, it's insane how much we're letting in. And it's all to keep the GDP figure so that they're afraid of a newspaper saying, oh, we're in recession.
Yeah.
But, if you're articulate like Poilievre, the opposition leader in Canada, you'll say, look, GDP's not a very good measure.
It's not.
And you'd fire half the Keynesians who run your treasury. I mean, they've been completely captured by one point of view in economics.
Okay, you mentioned Keynesianism twice, which broadly speaking, correct me if I'm wrong, is the Chicago School of Economics.
No, it's not. Milton.
Okay.
No, not Milton. It's Keynesian. It's I can't remember his first name. Maynard Keynes. Yeah. So it's all demand management, and your goal as a government is to, if the private sector is not doing it, is to step in and boost demand.
Right.
So even if that means hiring people to dig a hole and then filling it in.
Sure.
Right.
Otherwise known as council workers. That's what they do all day.
Except they don't really dig a hole.
Well,
but leaving that aside, yeah.
But that contrasts with as I understand it, again in my ignorance, the Austrian school of economics.
Yes.
So help us understand what would you like to see as a genuine alternative to this Keynesian view of economics?
Well, again, I'm not an economist.
Sure.
I grew up in a household of economists. My dad, my sister, my uncles. I'm the black sheep. I'm a lawyer. Nobody talks to me, I mean, for understandable reasons.
Yeah.
So I just would like to see people say, look, we're going to have the odd recession every once in a while, and this is just an inevitable fact of a capitalist economy. Instead of bending over backwards to try to spend and manipulate the settings so that you avoid that, and then it just builds up, and no one even thinks about paying back debt. I don't know what it is in the U.S. It's $1 trillion they're adding to their debt every 100 days.
Something like that. Yeah.
And so it's not too long from now that they'll be spending more on servicing the debt in the U.S. than they do on defense. And the Americans spend, I think it's down to 3%. When Reagan was in office, they spent 6% on defense.
Yeah, right.
And so, you have, if that's the world you live in, the idea that the Americans can finance a sort of Ukraine war forever is just implausible.
All right. Last question. As you look to the future, are you optimistic, are you hopeful, or are you not, and why?
I'm an optimistic sort of guy, but I'd like to see more people with a bit of bravery and fight in them. I totally understand that if you've got a mortgage and a young family, if you say things and they're going to fire you, it's very difficult to criticize. But there's an awful lot of people who are in a position where they could be braver and they're not. They don't want their friends at the dinner party to look down on them because they like Tony Abbott or something like that.
Or just to not get invited to the dinner party.
And I think what one of the biggest changes is if you go back 50 years, the sort of corporate, certainly this is true of lawyers, the median lawyer was politically to the right of the median voter.
Right.
Today, the median lawyer is about an order of magnitude plus to the left. They're just really left. Some of the most woke workplaces in Australia, go to a big Sydney law firm and go in, you better have your pronoun, and you'd be sued in tort if you said you liked Donald Trump because they'd all have a heart attack. So, and we saw this during The Voice.
Yeah.
The entire elite class, so not just the big civil servants, but all the corporations, the churches.
Yes,
everybody
sadly
came out for The Voice and it lost. This shows you that our elites are completely out of step. And again, I generalize, there's always outliers.
Sure.
But they're out of keeping with the average person. And that's a real problem. We've got to try to fix that. It would help if our conservative parties had a little bit of backbone. They don't, but it would be good if they did.
Well, hopefully that's something we can see change. James
Thank you.
Allan,
Yes.
what a pleasure.
You too.